Hi, I'm James Hamilton from Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal, and today I'll give you some tips that will help you turn ugly wood into beautiful wood so you can get the most out of your lumber. I don't do much commission work these days, but Pete does from time to time. And he had a customer who wanted a credenza made for some walnut that he got from a tree in his own backyard. So I said, let's build it here in this shop, because I knew this was going to be a great opportunity to show you how to make the best use of the wood you have on hand, even some you may have considered throwing away. We already made a video about how to turn rough lumber into project parts. I'll link to that below this video. This was a case of not having enough lumber, or at least not enough that matched. You see, the outer rings of a walnut tree are white sapwood that's usually thrown away because it's the dark heartwood that people go nuts over. Get it? Walnuts? But we didn't have that luxury. We couldn't throw wood away because the customer wanted to use it. So we decided to embrace the sapwood by making it a feature of the project through a process called book matching. If you slice a board down the center and you open the two halves up like a book, you'll find that the grain on one side is a mirror image of the grain on the other. In this case, a narrow board that has some unattractive sapwood on the edges becomes a wider board where the sapwood is balanced on both edges as well as down the center, creating interesting stripes. But we have a problem. Our panel may have been wider by gluing the two pieces edge to edge, but it's also a lot thinner, too thin for the side panels of the credenza. So now we have to make the wood thicker again by gluing our two book match pieces to another piece of wood as if they were just regular veneers. In this case, we used plywood because the edges of these side panels will be hidden by the legs, so nobody will be the wiser. But what if you don't have that luxury? What if the edges will be seen? That's a problem we had when it came to making the drawer fronts. We needed 4 boards to make all the drawer fronts, and we had 4 boards, but 2 of them had a mix of dark latewood and light sapwood, and the other 2 were only a light milky brown that didn't match the rest of the wood in the project and just didn't look good at all. One even had some ugly knots in it. Many woodworkers would have tossed all 4 of these boards. He certainly wouldn't have used this mishmash of secondary grade wood on the front of a cabinet where it's going to stand out like a sore thumb. He'd want boards that all looked similar, with grain that seemed to run evenly throughout, as if the entire front of the cabinet was made from one wide board. Our solution was to slice open the 2 boards with the sapwood and arrange them so those light areas became interesting and attractive features rather than flaws. It's amazing how book matching can balance the grain and totally transform it. Of course, these boards are now too thin for drawer fronts, and we can't glue them to plywood because the edges are going to be visible. We could edge band them, but why not make use of those other ugly boards that were too light or too knotty to use elsewhere in the project? What we're essentially doing is taking 4 boards that don't match each other at all, and we're turning them into 4 boards that look like they were meant to be together. Now, if you try to do this yourself, let me give you a few tips about veneering that'll help you along the way. While you can use a table saw, resawing is best done at a bandsaw, especially if the boards are wider than 4 or 5 inches. Cut slowly, let the blade do the work. If you find yourself pushing hard to feed the wood into the blade, you're overfeeding and it's going to result in a crooked cut. Another cause of crooked cuts is a dull blade, so check that as well. Perhaps we'll make a more comprehensive video about resawing down the road so you can have some more tips. By the time you cut and plane and sand everything flat, you're unlikely to get more than 2 1/4-inch pieces from a 3/4-inch board. If you start with rough sawn 4/4 stock and your saw is set up so that it's not going to drift much, you might get 4 1/8-inch veneers from a single board. There's going to be a lot of waste involved in resawing. It's not just a matter of the kerf that the blade takes, but it's a matter of getting it smooth and flat again afterwards. A drum sander is useful if you're making thin veneers, but you can also attach them to a piece of MDF with some double-sided tape and just feed them through your planer. But make sure you take very light passes. As you finish each board, wrap them in plastic so that they won't warp or cup before you glue them to the substrate. Speaking of substrates, the side panels of this project are plywood with that solid wood veneer on it. The veneers are 1/8 of an inch thick. So we glued the edges together using tape as clamps and weight to hold everything flat as it dries. This will ensure that the seam doesn't open up as we're gluing the veneers to the panel later. Contact cement is a good choice for this panel because it eliminates the need for clamps or for a vacuum press. If you've never worked with contact cement, you'll be surprised how easy it is. You just roll it on both mating surfaces and let it dry to the touch. You can test it by using the hairy part of your arm. If you touch it on the contact cement and it pulls at the hairs, it needs to dry a little bit more. Then assemble the two halves and use a roller, or in this case just a piece of wood, to press everything tightly together. This panel was made a bit oversized so it could be trimmed to the final dimensions after the veneer was in place, and the edges would all be nice. Now, in many cases where you put veneer on a substrate like plywood, you should veneer the back side as well. It doesn't have to be with the same nice wood, just something similar like another hardwood. Why? Because the veneer on one side is likely to shrink and expand with moisture, and it needs veneer on the other side shrinking and expanding at the same rate if you hope to keep that panel flat. However, in this case, the panel is going to be attached to a plywood box, so it can't cup even if it wanted to. So there was no need to veneer the back side. Wood movement is also a consideration when you choose the thickness of the veneers you're cutting. If I took a 3/4 inch thick piece of wood and I glued it to a piece of plywood, that solid wood is going to swell and shrink a lot more than the plywood will. Something has to give, and eventually it's going to split or delaminate. An 1/8 inch thick veneer, like we used for the side panels, will move a lot less than a 3/4 inch thick one. 1/16 would have been better, but veneers that thin are pretty hard for most people to cut on their bandsaw. While it's only my theory, and I'm not sure it's entirely true, I think the contact cement has a bit of flex in it that will allow for the tiny bit of movement that 1/8 inch veneer will be subject to. Now the drawer fronts were a different story. Those veneers are 1/4 inch thick, which is too thick to just glue to plywood. But we didn't glue them to plywood. We glued them to some less desirable walnut boards, which essentially turns the veneers back into boards again. This time we used yellow glue because the edge seams will be exposed and contact cement doesn't create a strong enough bond, and I'm afraid that people's fingers pulling open those drawers will pull that seam apart, and we don't want that. Notice how Pete spreads a heavy layer of glue on the thicker board, but he puts no glue on the thinner piece. That's because yellow glue has a lot of water in it. If you put it on the thinner piece, it's going to cause it to cup and curl, which will make it hard to align and clamp down. As long as you put plenty of glue on the thick side and you use plenty of clamps to apply even pressure, you'll get a strong glue joint without the hassles of the curled veneer. If you don't get squeezed out like this, you didn't use enough glue. With some clever resawing, book matching, and veneering, along with some edge banding and some plywood, this large piece of furniture was made with surprisingly few boards, many of which a lot of woodworkers would have just thrown out. So I hope that helps you with your next project. Power carving is a blast. You should try it sometime. Grab some scrap wood and some carbide burrs from Sabertooth power carving tools and just give it a go. You may be surprised what you're capable of, like this folk art eagle I made from 2x6s. Check out what Sabertooth has to offer at the link below this video. Wait, don't go yet. If you're new here, please subscribe and remember to ring the bell. I would really appreciate that. Give us a thumbs up, or better yet, leave us a comment. I always read them. And be sure to check out the latest issue of Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal. It's always packed with tips, tricks, and tutorials designed to make you a better woodworker.